Welcome back to Coates in Conversation. I'm your host, Kendra Coates, a licensed marriage and family therapist who works with couples and athletes in Alabama and Illinois. In today's conversation, I'll be speaking with Dr. Braden Brown, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a certified mental performance consultant, and currently an associate athletic director of mental health at BYU. Today's conversation, we'll be discussing the stigma around athlete mental health, athletes transitioning from high school to college sports, and the future of athlete mental health and mental performance. Dr. Braden Brown, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to chat with you again and good to see you again, Kendrick. Thanks for having me on.
I'm thankful for you to be on. I know this was something in the making, and I know we've had several conversations prior to that as it relates to athlete mental performance and athlete mental health. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I know most people probably know you as Braden, the former NFL athlete, collegiate athlete, standout high school athlete, and licensed mental health consultant. Who are you outside of that?
Well, I'm a dad. I've been married for almost 16 years, which is crazy to think about. High school was the longest 4 years of my life, and I felt like it was never going to end. And it's crazy to think that this June I'll have been married for 4x of what high school was. So I guess as they say, time flies when you're having fun. But yeah, I'm married to my wonderful, better 7/8, and we have three awesome kids. Started our parent journey with twins, and then had a little bit of a break in between, and now we have a little almost 2-year old. Our twins are 10, and our youngest is going to be 3 this July. So yeah, they keep things entertaining and busy. And then outside of that, I love to try to stay in shape. So I like to go to the gym. People ask me all the time, "Hey, you take care of all these people. Who's taking care of you?" And I say, the name is GYM. So yeah, I love working out, and I feel like if I'm going to be around athletes all the time, I still got to kind of look the part. And then I want to get good at golf. I like to golf. The getting good at golf part is really difficult and really challenging, but it gives me an opportunity to practice a lot of the mental skills that I try to teach my athletes on a daily basis. So that's kind of me outside of all this other stuff that people might know me as.
And I think that's a good transition into today's conversation. In your role, I know you've had a lot of good experience working with athletes. Despite the growing awareness, there's still a stigma around athletes seeking mental health services or mental performance coaching. What are the biggest barriers keeping athletes from prioritizing their mental well-being?
It's a great question. And as I think about it, and kind of in my experience being in this setting, working with collegiate athletes primarily, and I get a sense from them what really does prevent them from reaching out to someone like me or other individuals in this space. And I think part of it has to do with lack of education. And that's one of the things that I've been experiencing as a licensed therapist. And I think with that word in particular, therapist, therapy, mental health is very different connotation than mental performance, sports psychology, et cetera. So I think the lexicon around what it is actually that people in this space are capable of doing and what we provide, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding there. And then there's some stigma specifically with certain terms like therapy and therapist, because almost instantly, and this isn't just specific to student athletes, but when people hear therapist or mental health, and I experienced this during my time working in clinical medical facilities where the first reaction is, oh, so you think I'm crazy. If I'm talking to a mental health person, that means I have to have problems and I have to have issues that need to be fixed. And so I'd say that's one of the things. And the other thing is just time. And I kind of have a counter argument to that too. But I do think people forget how time intensive being a student and an athlete is. And then it just kind of turns into being, one more thing that they have to carve out in their busy schedule to do. So I think those are probably the two biggest things I've encountered since I've been in this space.
When you said the stigma and that automatic assumption when you hear therapy or mental health, it's, oh, am I crazy? Which is unfortunate because, in my opinion, you don't have to go to a therapist or see a counselor or a psychologist just because of X, Y, and Z. Some of this can be life transition. Some of it can you internalizing maybe a dropped ball on the football field or a bad shot, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see athletes come in with those same kind of narratives around mental health? And I want to highlight, you did a research study, and the article was Can We Talk? And it was exploring the effects of mental health stigma, support, and openness on National Collegiate Athlete Association student athlete mental health. So can you kind of bring in some of the aspects of what you found with that research as it pertains to the stigma of athlete mental health?
Yeah, it's actually one of the kind of the counter arguments I use with athletes, and I use specifically findings from that study, which thankfully I was able to publish from my dissertation data. So kind of the Cliff Notes version of that study is we found that athletes, and it was a pretty wide-reaching study. It had 477 athletes from throughout the entire country, East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, you name it, which was awesome. I really wanted to try to represent not just a minority of student athletes, but as many student athletes as possible. And what we found in that study is that actually higher levels of stigma, as it was defined in the study, of viewing mental health as a sign of weakness or seeking help for mental health challenges as making you lesser than or quote unquote weak. So athletes that exhibited higher levels of mental health stigma had greater levels of anxiety, depression, stress, etc. And then another interesting finding is that people who were actually more willing and open to talk about mental health challenges had lower levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. And then with the support variable, people who felt supported in seeking mental health. And this is a really big and important point too when it comes to what actually facilitates people and their willingness to seek mental health is people who felt supported by coaches, teammates, family members to seek help for mental health struggles had lower levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. So really interesting findings. And I know that's kind of the reverse of the question you asked, but one of the facilitators that I found is having coaches that are bought into the importance of mental health. And I'm fortunate to work with a lot of coaches here at BYU who really understand, value, and prioritize athletes, specifically male athletes. And that's something that's really consistent in the literature too, is that male athletes are typically the least likely to reach out for mental health or admit that they're having mental health issues. And so when you work with teams and you have male coaches stand up in front of a bunch of male athletes and say, "Hey guys, look, mental health, seeking help for mental health doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you less than. It actually makes you more of a man because it's having the humility and the awareness to know that we all need help. And it's not about having problems. It's not about having issues. It's just about being the best version of you that you can be. So please use the resources that we have here. Please reach out to me." And having a coach stand up and say that to athletes goes such a long way, and it makes my job a lot easier.
So there's that sense of, like you said, buy-in. There's that sense of support. I'd also imagine that for some athletes, and we'll just take in my experiences as being an African American athlete and not seeing too many people within my community seeking out mental health support, I'd imagine in your experiences in doing this research that maybe a coach who looks like a minority student athlete, it's kind of like one of those, like a male role model for some, or a female role model, that there's more likelihood of that athlete walking into the door because now it's, hey, this isn't too bad. What are your experiences with that?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I guess I should have been a little bit more um, explicit with my last example. So I was specifically referring to Coach Kalani Sitake, who is a Polynesian male, and he's been very open about this with me in conversations. And I think it's kind of just a well-known part of different cultures that, kind of mental health is not viewed as something to be catered to or addressed. It's kind of just, just suck it up and figure it out and smack you upside the head and, keep moving forward and be more resilient. And not that those things are always necessarily a bad thing, right? Resilience is a really important part of mental health. But to your point, it goes so much farther to have a guy like Coach Satake stand up in front of a team of other Polynesian, African American, and even white male student athletes and say, "Look, guys, this is an important part of this process, and it's something that you really need to prioritize and take advantage of." It makes a huge difference.
Shout out to that coach, because I don't know, it's one of those things to where it's such an important thing, as you and I know, it's such an important thing, but in some of the things that I've experienced, and even just the clinical experiences, holding on to emotions, internalizing things, there's a lot of times there's not really a good outcome, which makes me think about another thing. And I know this is kind of veering off a little bit. You mentioned anxiety and depression. Do you ever find that athletes who are experiencing more anxiety and or depression, do you see any type of correlation with an increase of injuries or drop performance?
Yeah, I would say anecdotally, Um, we as a sports science staff have experienced that and witnessed that firsthand. And then also there's quite a bit of research that also supports that as well, that anxiety, depression before the season actually leads to a greater incidence of injury occurrence in the middle of season. So there is a pretty strong correlation there. And then as far as like the overall performance, yeah, that's in a lot of ways, I view that's why I have my job here is so that I can help with that aspect. And I know that we talked about how there's a stigma when it comes to people reaching out for help. I will also say that it's important to recognize that where we are currently today, I think is very different than where we were when I was an athlete here 12 plus years ago, in the sense that I think that people are kind of generally more accepting and more likely to utilize the mental health resources available, just because I think there is a little bit more acceptance of mental health and the issues it can cause with sport performance. But I do think we still have a long way to go. But yeah, it definitely has an impact. The mental and the physical, they're so intricately tied together that it's impossible to separate the two.
Mm. You, there's definitely, you mentioned just as you were competing, I'm even going back to, geez, 2008. So it was around the time when I was competing in the high school and collegiate level where, I mean, I remember athletes, even myself, coming off the field, um, multiple concussions, and still it's just kind of like rub some dirt on it, get back out there and play, or you got a pulled hamstring, let's tape it up. Which in the long run, it has, in my experience, taught me to suppress when I have a need or when I have an injury, et cetera, et cetera. So as we think about it on the high school level, many high school athletes struggle when they transition from high school to college sports. What are some key mental and emotional skills you'd like to see more parents help their athletes develop in high school before they transition to the next level?
I love this question. To me, I think it boils down to becoming more resilient in the face of adversity. I had a great conversation with one of our freshman athletes the other day, and she made the comment to me. I was talking to one of my teammates, and we decided that so much of sport really does just come down to learning how to effectively respond to failure and mistakes. And I'm like, Amen. I agree with you 100%.
Mhm.
But I think that it's tough because in the sport and the high competitive sport culture, and you experience this, I experience this, that there is that pressure and expectation to constantly be the best and perform at a high level. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that it can reinforce this idea that if I fail, then I'm not good enough. And we take away the really important aspect in this overall process that failure is 100% inevitable, unavoidable, and it's going to happen. And it's not necessarily the failure of the mistake in and of itself that becomes problematic. It's our relationship to or how we respond in the face of failure, adversity, mistakes that can really make a difference. And so I think learning to understand that that's a big part of the process and being more resilient to how we respond to mistakes is a really vital skill to develop.
I guess sometimes the unfortunate part is kind of like what you said. There's depending on the sports culture or the coach, sometimes athletes don't necessarily feel like they have the space to fail. And I think of just kind of from a trauma standpoint of how detrimental that can be for an athlete who may have grown up in a household, hypercritical parents or parent or caregiver, or there was some type of trauma that played into, well, coach doesn't like me, so everybody hates me, or it triggers some of those nervous system responses from previous experiences. In your experience, have you seen athletes have those type of experiences where home life was somewhat disrupted, maybe coming from a, I don't want to say broken home, but a home that didn't necessarily have that emotional safety? Have you seen any impact when they transition from high school to college?
Yeah, for sure. It's almost like you set me up perfectly to talk about one of my other studies that I published from my dissertation data. That was actually the original study was I was looking at adverse childhood experiences and how that affected the mental health and well-being of NCAA student athletes. But yeah, that's such a good point. And that's why there's a huge push nowadays for this trauma-informed therapy because it's whether we like it to or not, it doesn't change the fact that our brain doesn't just forget some of these adverse experiences that we experience throughout our life. And then when we're put in high stress situations, then of course our brain and our body is going to respond in a way to try to protect ourselves and keep us safe. It's an involuntary nervous system response that we all have built into each one of us. And so that's a big part of it. And that's another important thing that I was hoping that we were going to be able to address at some point, which is, and it's another thing that Coach Satake said to me too. He said, you know, it's almost like as coaches, we need to be trained therapists in order to best coach these athletes because there are so many different factors and cultural differences and familial upbringings and experiences that all cultivate into now being in this group setting where we have to try to figure out how to most effectively navigate and manage all of these different variables and factors in a high intense or high intensity, high stress, highly competitive environment where those things are going to show up. And that's another thing that I try to work with the athletes on is being able to recognize that and develop some of the skills around effectively navigating those moments when they do show up and helping them understand that yes, you might be expected to be this all-star athlete on the court or on the field, but that doesn't change the fact that you're still a human first. And to be a human means you're going to have a lot of complex thoughts, feelings, emotions, prior experiences, et cetera, that if we don't learn how to properly navigate or manage, are 100% going to get in your way of being able to be your best.
So with the high school athlete who grew up in a household that wasn't emotionally safe, there was some sort of abuse and or neglect. What do athletes need to know in those situations when they know that, hey, I got a scholarship to such and such school, but I know my home life may impact how I show up in this space? What kind of advice or what kind of direction would you give them?
Yeah, I would say this is going to be one of the many new skill sets is going to be really important for you to learn as you navigate that transition from high school to college. One of the examples I use is you basically go your whole life from 0 to 18 being guided, dictated, taught what's right, what's wrong, what values matter, what doesn't matter. And then all of a sudden, when you leave that setting, that environment, you go into unfamiliar territory. And your brain is always going to want to revert back to what feels comfortable, safe, and familiar, even if what's comfortable, safe, and familiar is completely dysfunctional or toxic or whatever else. And sometimes people aren't even aware of that, right? And so it's bringing awareness to that, okay, this is what's actually going on. This is what your brain's trying to do. And it may have been an adaptive coping strategy that you weren't necessarily aware of at the time to help you survive whatever it was you were going through, but now it's no longer serving that same purpose. And so we have to learn new ways to adapt to the new environment that's actually going to be more helpful for you. But it's easier said than done. That's one of the most common things I say to the athletes that I work with is all of this is easier said than done because what we're basically asking you to do is you've grown up your whole life writing with your right hand or left hand, and now we're asking you to switch the pen to the other side, and that's going to be challenging. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be frustrating. But the more you learn to write with that non-dominant hand, the better you're going to get at it over time. And so it's going to require a lot of patience, consistency, diligence, intentionality, et cetera. But eventually we'll get to a new way of functioning and operating that's actually more conducive to the current environment versus what helped you in the old environment.
I'm so glad that you mentioned we often revert back to what we know, what we feel, what feels safe. I often, even when we think about anxiety, how, and I'll just take my own experiences as being a former athlete of how clueless I was to what anxiety even meant, what it looked like, what it felt like. And I was just thinking about this earlier today. There would be times when I was in the locker room and the coach would be giving, a speech and I fell asleep every single time. And this was before the actual game started. And I know what I know is I was my sense the environment was so overwhelming that my body was just like, we need to shut down. We need to go in safety mode. And I often think, yeah, if we don't have awareness over those things, how can we actually change or build tools to effectively cope with that said thing? We've kind of talked through the stigma around mental health as it relates to athletes, high school athletes transitioning to collegiate sports. Where do you see the field of athlete mental health and mental performance coaching going in the next 5 years, especially at the high school and college level?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it's going to continue expanding and growing into the collegiate level, and I think it's going to trickle down into the high school level. I was having a conversation with one of my former teammates, total stud. He's still playing in the NFL, Kyle Van Noy. This was at a golf tournament last year, and he's like, man, it's so awesome what you're doing at BYU for these guys. But he's like, honestly, all this stuff really needs to start at the high school level because that's when people, it's just more formative years and people are really being shaped and how to view things and think about things and manage emotions and distractions and all that stuff. And so I do think ultimately we're going to have positions like I'm in right now at BYU in different high schools. I think the challenge is going to be the lack of funding. But I do think that the case can be made that because mental health in and of itself is such a huge challenge that so many of these high school, not only athletes, but just high school students in general are facing, that it's something that needs to be invested in and prioritized. Because like an athlete that I was meeting with just before I got on this call with you, made the comment, I love all of this stuff we're talking about because it doesn't just apply to sport, it applies to
Mm.
life and just being better in life in general. And I said, exactly. It's a beautiful thing.
So when you mentioned positions popping up more like the position you're in, I know one of the things that oftentimes comes up is, well, psychologists are the first ones, sports psychologists are the first ones that get these roles. You're a licensed marriage and family therapist. So are there any shifts happening in that regard to where psychologists still are important, but they're also taking into consideration LPCs, so licensed professional counselors, marriage and family therapists, et cetera, et cetera?
I think that's really going to come down to folks like you and me really going to bat for what separates marriage and family therapists from the other mental health professions. And I'm not trying to throw shade on any other profession because we all have our unique, areas of expertise and we all have our unique training. I do think though that when it comes to understanding systems and teams and how people operate and affect and influence people within those systems, I think that's where, as a trained marriage and family therapist, through systems theory training, really helps position us well to be in those settings. Because you think about a high school setting, like there are so many different layers of systems, from the principal to the administrators to the teachers to the aides to the kids in the schools to the coaches and people that aren't accustomed to working through all those different dynamics and seeing how they all piece together. I think it could be a little bit more of a challenge. So I think that that's going to come down to having strong advocates in our field really go to bat to help people understand that, we are also very qualified and we have distinct and different training that might actually be more helpful in settings like that.
It's always interesting, at least my time in grad school, we'd always bring up, we have such that unique skill set of seeing systems as you were mentioning, but also navigating the dynamics of multiple people in the same room. Which, I'm not saying that other professions or trained professionals can't do that, but that's what we spend a bulk of our time doing. How do you navigate multiple people in a room, conflict resolution, et cetera? As we wrap up today's conversation, we definitely talked through a lot of topics that we probably could have stayed on for the next hour. If you could change one thing about how we approach athlete mental health and performance training in sports culture today, what would it be and why?
I think we kind of talked about it a little bit, but just to reemphasize, I hope that it gets to a point where it's viewed as just as important, if not more important, than every other thing that goes into training to be an elite level athlete. So, strength and conditioning, film work, athletic training, prehab, rehab, all of those things. It should be viewed as this is a requirement. This is an essential part of what's going to make me the best most highly functioning student athlete that I can possibly be. I think we're getting close to that point, but I do think that there's some some room for improvement. But I think that viewing it, and again, kind of like you hit the nail on the head earlier, you don't have to be out of shape to work with a personal trainer or go to the gym, right? The gym isn't just for people who are out of shape or who are trying to get in shape. It's for all sorts of people on varying levels of the journey that they're on. Some people are in elite level shape and they still go to the gym, right? Because they want to fine tune things and stay in shape. Some people are very out of shape and they want to get healthier, and so they go to the gym and they benefit from the gym. But it's the same thing mentally. It's like one of my favorite athletes I've worked with was probably head and shoulders above any other athlete that I've met with mentally. And he sought me out from the first day he stepped on campus and wanted to meet with me on a weekly basis because he knew how important it was. And in my mind, I'm sitting here thinking, dude, you're already so far ahead of so where so many other people are. Like, but I love it, right? Because it's a priority for him and he understands how important it is. And I hope that we can get to a place where it's not viewed as, oh, I'm weak or I'm soft or I have problems, but it's like, man, I want to elevate myself. I want to be the best version of myself that I can be. And I have to prioritize the mental side in order to get there.
I love that. Moving forward, if you could think of 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what would you want your legacy to be?
And I hope I'm still doing the same thing. I hope I'm still young enough and relevant enough that these athletes don't view me as just a washed up has been. I think some of them are already to that place, and that's fine too. But I, I really, I really just want to try to make the biggest impact I possibly can on as many people as I can and help them understand that I'm not, and I didn't really get into this, but I think it's important for listeners to know that I'm not just this guy who's been dialed in and had it figured out mentally my whole life. Like it's something that I really struggled with my whole career. And honestly, it's probably what held me back more than anything else. I had the physical tools, the physical ability, but mentally I was kind of a train wreck. And so a lot of this, I already feel like I'm kind of living out that legacy of giving back and helping others do it better than I did it. But I hope to continue doing that and just reaching and impacting and affecting as many people as I possibly can.
Braden, I want to just take the moment and thank you for everything that you're doing for our field. You're a true leader in this space and trying to create more of acceptance around mental health and mental performance with athletes. Appreciate all the work that you do because you are important for our space. And I thank you for every conversation that we have because I always learn something new. As we wrap up the conversation today, be sure to go out and like and subscribe to Coats in Conversation. Drop a comment. What was your favorite part of this episode? We've covered many topics, and these are conversations that need to continue to happen in this space. Athlete mental health is not a weakness. Athlete mental health does not mean that you're not good enough. Athlete mental health is important because it does have an impact on your performance.